You won't believe what Donnie McClurkin just confessed in his latest testimony. It's sending shockwaves across the internet. For years, Donnie McClurkin has been known as a powerful figure in the gospel music world. He's inspired millions with his incredible voice and unwavering faith. But now, he's opened up like never before, and what he revealed has shocked everyone. In a raw and deeply personal moment, McClurkin said, "I still want to be gay." These words, so unexpected coming from a man who has been such an icon of Christian faith, have ignited a firestorm of reactions. His confession has left people talking, questioning, and wondering what it really means for his journey, his legacy, and the Christian community as a whole. Let me tell you, this is how it all started. Donnie McClurkin, who for decades has been the face of redemption and overcoming struggles, delivered this bombshell during a heartfelt and intimate conversation. This wasn't just any regular speech. This wasn't a stage performance or a scripted sermon. This was McClurkin speaking directly from his heart, admitting a struggle that he had kept hidden for so long. For many, it was a moment of truth, one that completely shifted the image of the man they thought they knew. But here's the shocking part. McClurkin didn't just say it once and leave it at that. He was candid about how, despite his deep faith and the years he spent sharing his testimony of redemption, he still wrestles with same-sex attraction. This confession isn't just another revelation in the life of a celebrity. It's a revelation that could change the way people think about faith, sexuality, and redemption, especially in the Christian community. For years, McClurkin had been seen as a beacon of hope for those struggling with their own sexuality. He was the man who, despite his own battles, stood tall and preached the message of God's deliverance. His testimony had been one of overcoming, one of victory, where he claimed that he had defeated the desires that many considered sinful. He had been celebrated for his message of overcoming same-sex attraction through prayer and faith, often sharing his personal story of finding peace. He was admired by fans and church leaders alike for his courage to be vulnerable and for his testimony that it was possible to be delivered from the grip of temptation. But now, everything was turned upside down. His confession challenged everything he had stood for. His words were met with disbelief, confusion, and even anger from many of his supporters, particularly those who had looked up to him as the ultimate example of faith conquering all. Could it be that Donnie McClurkin, the gospel legend, was now admitting that his battle was not over? Could it be that despite all these years of preaching about deliverance, he was still facing the same struggles he once claimed to have overcome? The internet exploded with reactions. Some people couldn't believe what they were hearing, while others felt betrayed by the man who had long been their inspiration. As the days went on, the reactions grew even more intense. The gospel community, which had long been divided on issues of sexuality, now found itself at a crossroads. McClurkin's words were a twist no one had seen coming, a twist that would force the church and his fans to confront a much deeper question. What does it really mean to overcome temptation? Is the struggle ever really over, or is it an ongoing battle? Can someone truly be delivered, or is it more about learning to live with your struggles, no matter how hard it may be? The craziest part about this entire situation is how McClurkin's admission sparked a massive shift in the conversation surrounding faith and sexuality. As he admitted, "I still want to be gay," he didn't just throw doubt on his own testimony. He raised larger questions about the intersection of faith and sexuality, especially for those who feel torn between the two. For some, this was a moment of authenticity. They saw his confession as brave, even revolutionary. For others, however, it was a huge setback, a confirmation of all their fears about the dangers of his past message. And yet, no matter how people felt, McClurkin had undoubtedly thrown the door wide open for a conversation that many had been too afraid to have before. This was where it got interesting. McClurkin wasn't just talking about his personal journey anymore. His testimony wasn't only about him, it was about something much larger, a shift in how the church and society views LGBTQ plus individuals within the Christian faith. The biggest question became, if someone as strong in faith as Donnie McClurkin could still have these desires, what does that mean for the rest of us? And more importantly, what does that say about the church's stance on sexuality? The reactions to Donnie McClurkin's confession spread like wildfire. People couldn't stop talking about it. Social media platforms exploded with every possible opinion on the matter. Fans were torn between admiration for his honesty and disappointment over his vulnerability. As the comments, tweets, and posts kept pouring in, it became clear that McClurkin's revelation was about to spark a much bigger conversation, one that had been brewing for a long time. You see, the Christian community for years has struggled to navigate the complex relationship between faith and sexuality. On one hand, there are those who believe that any attraction outside the traditional marriage between a man and a woman is a sin. They often preach about deliverance, about overcoming same-sex attraction through prayer and faith. McClurkin had been that beacon for so many. His story was one of victory. But now, with his latest admission, things weren't as clear-cut anymore. His message of deliverance, which had helped countless individuals, seemed to be unraveling before everyone's eyes. People in the Christian world began questioning, was McClurkin's struggle a sign of failure? Or was it a reflection of the truth that many individuals, no matter how strong their faith, would continue to battle temptations? For some, it was a heartbreaking revelation, the end of an era. They had placed McClurkin on a pedestal, viewing him as someone who had conquered his past. To hear that his journey was still ongoing was deeply unsettling. It challenged everything they thought they knew about faith and redemption. But for others, McClurkin's honesty was a breath of fresh air. They saw it as a courageous moment, one that opened the door for those who had been silently battling similar struggles. The truth was, McClurkin wasn't alone in his experience. Countless people within the church had wrestled with similar feelings of guilt, shame, and confusion, trying to reconcile their sexuality with their faith. Many had felt the pressure to deny their truth for fear of rejection. McClurkin's confession, though controversial, gave those people the courage to speak out and share their own stories. As the debate raged on, one thing became clear. McClurkin had just become the face of an issue that many had been too afraid to address. No longer could people ignore the tension that existed between traditional Christian teachings and the reality of human sexuality. The divide in the church was growing wider. There were those who believed that McClurkin's message was one of defeat, while others felt it was a powerful statement of authenticity. Regardless of where anyone stood, the discussion about sexuality, identity, and faith could no longer be swept under the rug. Amidst all this chaos, McClurkin remained silent for a while. He had shared his truth, and now the world was reacting. Some people were supportive, telling him how much they respected his honesty. Others, however, were quick to criticize him, calling his words a betrayal. "You've let us down," some said. "You're supposed to be an example of how to live a godly life, and now you're admitting you're still struggling." These were hard words that cut deep for McClurkin, but he understood that this was the price of speaking out. Yet, there was an underlying sadness in McClurkin's silence. While he had been a symbol of strength for so many years, now he seemed unsure of how to navigate the firestorm his confession had ignited. He knew that no matter what he said next, he wouldn't be able to undo the impact of his words. But McClurkin also understood something that many missed. His journey wasn't over. This wasn't the end of his story. This was just another chapter in a much larger narrative. At the same time, an interesting thing was happening. As the online world debated his honesty, McClurkin became a symbol of what it truly meant to struggle and still be faithful. For some, it was a reflection of the human condition, the idea that no one, not even the most devout, is immune to temptation. And for others, it was a glimpse into the reality of living in the tension between the ideals of faith and the complexities of human nature. But the conversation didn't stop there. McClurkin's statement forced people to examine their own beliefs about sexuality and sin. Could someone be a devout Christian and still experience same-sex attraction? Was it possible to love God and struggle with something considered to be against his will? For many, McClurkin's admission turned the question of sexuality in the church from a distant issue into something deeply personal. And then came the voices from those who had long been marginalized, the LGBTQ plus Christians. For years, they had felt excluded, shamed, and rejected by the very community that should have been offering love and support. They had lived in the shadows, afraid to speak out for fear of being condemned. Now, with McClurkin's confession, they saw an opportunity to finally step into the light. His words had given them permission to share their own stories, to acknowledge that their struggles were real and that their faith wasn't any less valid because of their sexuality. Yet, even in this newfound openness, there was a sense of unease. The church had not yet fully embraced these conversations. There were still so many who rejected the idea of reconciling faith and sexuality. For them, McClurkin's story was proof of what could go wrong if someone didn't follow the correct path. But for others, McClurkin was becoming an unlikely hero, the one who had dared to tell the truth, even when it was uncomfortable. As the weeks went on, the conversation surrounding Donnie McClurkin's confession intensified. It wasn't just the Christian community that was watching. People from all walks of life began to weigh in. News outlets started covering the story more extensively, presenting it as a cultural turning point. McClurkin's words had struck a chord with more than just his fans. They had become a symbol of the intersection between faith, sexuality, and identity. But with this widespread attention came the pressure, and McClurkin was starting to feel it in ways he hadn't anticipated. He knew his words had power, but the backlash was much fiercer than he could have ever imagined. People from all corners of the religious world began to question his credibility. Church leaders were forced to address the issue in their own congregations, with many feeling torn. Some defended him, saying that his honesty was a necessary step forward in acknowledging the struggles many individuals face in their personal faith journeys. Others, however, saw it as a betrayal, a misstep that threatened the very foundation of the church's teachings on marriage and sexuality. The division within the church became more pronounced. In some circles, McClurkin's confession sparked conversations about what it meant to truly love and accept people for who they were, regardless of their sexual orientation. In others, his struggle was framed as a failure, an example of how even the most devoted can fall. Those in favor of McClurkin began pushing for a broader understanding of grace and redemption, arguing that no one should be condemned for simply being human, for grappling with real struggles that didn't negate their faith. But the more they spoke, the more entrenched the opposition became. As for McClurkin himself, he found himself in a deep state of reflection. The weight of his decision to speak out was starting to take its toll. On the one hand, he felt relieved to have shared his truth, but on the other, he couldn't ignore the growing distance between himself and the people who had supported him for years. It was a painful realization that the price of honesty was a certain kind of isolation. He wasn't just facing judgment from those outside his circle. Even some of his closest friends and colleagues seemed to be pulling away. They struggled to reconcile the person they had known with the man who had now publicly admitted his ongoing battles. Yet, through it all, McClurkin held on to one belief, that he wasn't alone in his struggle. His personal experience, as challenging as it was wasn't unique. The world around him was filled with individuals just like him, quietly facing their own internal wars between faith and identity. His confession, whether he realized it at the time or not, had opened a door for so many others to step into the light. Still, McClurkin's public journey wasn't without moments of doubt. There were days when he questioned whether he had done the right thing. Was his honesty helping the church, or was it driving a wedge between himself and his followers? He was starting to understand that for some, the truth he had shared was too uncomfortable to accept. There were those who saw his struggle as proof of moral failure, while others saw it as an opportunity for healing and transformation. He couldn't change the way people reacted. All he could do was continue being true to himself. Amidst the noise, there were also moments of unexpected support. Some fans reached out privately, telling him how his words had helped them confront their own struggles. For them, McClurkin had become a beacon of hope. He wasn't perfect, but neither was anyone else. It wasn't his flaws that made him relatable. It was his willingness to acknowledge them and continue on his path of faith. Those messages, though they were fewer than the criticisms, helped to keep him grounded. It reminded him that, despite everything, he had touched lives in ways he hadn't anticipated. As more voices joined the conversation, McClurkin's story began to take on a new form. The initial shock of his admission began to settle, and what remained was the deeper question: what does it really mean to live in faith while navigating the complexities of human desire and identity? Was it possible to be a devout Christian and still experience same-sex attraction? Or was McClurkin an exception to the rule? These questions, once largely avoided, were now at the forefront of every discussion about faith and sexuality. And while McClurkin's personal story was central to the conversation, it had sparked something much bigger. A widespread reassessment of how the church viewed LGBTQ+ individuals and their place within the body of Christ. At the same time, McClurkin found himself facing not only external judgment, but internal conflict. His own understanding of God's love was being tested in ways he hadn't expected. His faith, which had always been a source of strength, now seemed to come with a new set of questions. Could he reconcile his love for God with his human struggles? Was it enough to trust that God loved him despite his temptations? These were questions that no one had ever asked him to confront before, at least not in such a personal, raw way. But as the months passed, McClurkin began to speak more openly about his own journey, not just about the struggles with his sexuality, but also about his evolving understanding of grace, forgiveness, and acceptance. He began to see his battle not as something to be ashamed of, but as an integral part of his faith story. This wasn't the end of his journey. This was the point where he could truly embrace the process of becoming whole, no matter what anyone else thought. The questions surrounding McClurkin's confession continued to stir the pot. The debate wasn't over yet, and it wasn't clear where it would lead. But one thing was certain. Donnie McClurkin's journey had opened up a conversation that had long been ignored. In a way, he had become a catalyst for change, not just in the church, but in the lives of many who felt that they, too, had to choose between their faith and their true selves. And though the road ahead remained uncertain, McClurkin knew that, in his heart, he was no longer alone in his struggle. As time went on, the conversation about Donnie McClurkin's confession began to shift in unexpected ways. What had once been seen as a scandal or a personal failure was slowly evolving into a broader dialogue about the nature of faith, identity, and acceptance. The church, which had initially struggled to process his admission, began to reflect on the deeper implications of McClurkin's journey. It was clear that his personal story was a microcosm of a much larger issue, one that affected countless individuals within the faith community who had long struggled in silence. McClurkin, despite the continued scrutiny, began to find a sense of peace in his evolving relationship with God. He realized that his faith was not about having all the answers or conforming to everyone else's expectations. It was about embracing his own path, no matter how difficult. He had come to understand that God's love wasn't conditional and that the journey toward healing wasn't a linear process. It was messy, complicated, and full of moments of doubt, but that didn't make it any less real or meaningful. More importantly, McClurkin began to see his struggles not as a source of shame, but as a testimony of resilience. He was no longer hiding or running from his truth. Instead, he was embracing it, sharing it with others who were facing the same internal battles. His story had become a beacon of hope for many who had felt like they were walking alone in the darkness, convinced that their faith and their desires could never coexist. They saw in McClurkin's openness a reflection of their own struggles and were inspired by his willingness to continue fighting, even when the odds seemed stacked against him. For McClurkin, the journey was far from over. There were still difficult days, moments when the weight of judgment and isolation felt overwhelming. He still faced questions from fans, friends, and fellow churchgoers, but he had learned to accept that these questions, while difficult, were part of the process. He didn't have all the answers, and he never would. But what he did have was the unwavering belief that at the end of the day, God's grace was enough, that his worth wasn't determined by his struggles or his past mistakes, but by the love and forgiveness that transcended them. Over time, McClurkin's experience sparked change in unexpected places. Some church leaders, initially resistant to the idea of reconciling faith and same-sex attraction, began to reconsider their stance. Slowly but surely, there were pockets of progress within the faith community, as more people came to see that their fellow believers didn't have to fit a perfect mold to be accepted and loved. McClurkin had started a conversation, one that had been long overdue, and though it was messy and complicated, it was necessary. McClurkin's journey also began to impact his music. He was no longer singing just to entertain or inspire. He was singing from a place of deep personal truth. His songs, once filled with an idealized vision of faith, began to reflect the complexities of his own walk with God. His music became a form of therapy, not just for him, but for those who found comfort in his words. Through his lyrics, he was able to give voice to the emotions and struggles that so many others had felt, but had been too afraid to express. His songs became a platform for healing, for understanding, and for the ongoing journey of acceptance. And as his story continued to unfold, McClurkin found himself in new spaces where people were no longer focused on his past mistakes or struggles, but were instead looking to the future. He had become a symbol not of perfection, but of redemption. His journey had shown that faith wasn't about fitting a mold or meeting an ideal. It was about the willingness to grow, to stumble, and to rise again. It was about embracing one's own truth, even when it was difficult, and knowing that God's love would still be there to carry them through. The public's perception of McClurkin also began to shift. He was no longer seen as a figure to be judged or criticized. Instead, he was viewed as a man who had lived through a painful personal journey and had come out stronger on the other side. People who had once condemned him now saw him as a source of strength and courage. They understood that the same love and grace they had extended to others could also be extended to him. McClurkin's ability to be vulnerable, to share his struggles openly, had transformed him from a symbol of scandal into a beacon of hope and reconciliation. Looking back on everything that had happened, McClurkin was able to see the larger picture. His confession, though painful at the time, had served a purpose. It had sparked conversations, created space for healing, and helped many individuals feel less alone in their own struggles. He had become a living testament to the fact that God's grace wasn't reserved for the perfect or the righteous, but for the broken and the real. He had learned that in the end, it wasn't about being flawless. It was about being honest, being willing to face the truth and trusting that God's love would always be there to guide them through it. And so McClurkin's journey continued, not as a quest for perfection, but as a pursuit of truth, faith, and healing. It was a journey that would never be easy, but one that he knew was worth walking for himself, for his community, and for anyone else who had ever felt that their faith and their identity were incompatible. With each step, he was building a bridge of understanding, one that could carry others along with him. And though he had no way of knowing where the road would lead, he knew that he was no longer walking it alone.